We are here today celebrating Invasive Species Awareness Week in Washington. This is something that Governor Jay Inslee proclaimed within the state of Washington in solidarity with National Invasive Species Awareness Week. All across the nation this week, we have events similar to this happening in the local communities, at the state level, at the national level, educating congressional delegates and everyone that we can reach to inform them about invasive species and the damages that they cause to our economy as well as our environment. So all this week we'll be celebrating different aspects of invasive species and spreading the word so that we can be protecting our valuable resources and taking simple actions to protect the things that we know and love. So would like to thank you for joining. And Peter, please go to the next slide when you're ready. Great. Well, invasive species can be plants, they can be animals, they can be insects, they can also be pathogens. In Washington State, we have over 700 invasive species that we know are present. And this week, we're raising awareness about all those different invasive species. And that's what we want everyone to be aware of, is to not only be aware of specific invasive species like the plants or the animals or the insects that you see pictured here in cartoon form, but we also want you to recognize signs and symptoms of invasive species. And almost more importantly, we want you to know how to communicate what you're seeing on the landscape. So if you're recreating out on a hike, out on a bike, walking your dog, whatever you're doing in your everyday life, we want you to be aware of invasive species. And if you see something, we want you to say something. Don't be concerned about whether or not you're correct in what you're diagnosing. We love to look at native species and tell you some really interesting facts about the native species, plants or animals that are on our landscape. And so if you see something, say something, and we will respond. Sometimes some things that we're spotting may be new invasive species, and your report might be the first detection of something in Washington. And that's really our goal, is that we find the very first plant, animal, or insect and respond so that we can actually eradicate it from our landscape. Today, we're going to be focusing on one of the major forces across Washington that is responsible for eradicating invasive species from our landscape. And when something's beyond eradication, it often involves control and containment. So I'm really happy to be highlighting the Washington Conservation Corps today and spreading awareness about the function of the Washington Conservation Corps and sharing some information about how you can actually partner with them to stop invasive species. This is the second webinar of the week. Today, we're focusing on the Washington Conservation Corps. And the Washington Conservation Corps creates future leaders through community involvement as well as mentorship. And when it comes to invasive species, the Washington Conservation Corps plays a big role in many different projects across the state of Washington. And I'm really pleased to be introducing you to Peter Nevin today, who is the logistics coordinator for the Washington State Department of Ecology's Washington Conservation Corps program. And Peter is one of the most knowledgeable people I know about invasive species and has seen and done about everything. So he's the perfect person to be introducing the Washington Conservation Corps to you. And I'm really excited to be introducing Peter today. So with that, over to you, Peter.
All right, thanks, Justin. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. Invasive Species Awareness Week has always been a personal passion of mine, having spent over a decade out in the field attempting to control and prevent the spread of invasive species. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to present on the Washington Conservation Corps and our part in helping restore habitats all across Washington State. So my goal today is to give just a little bit about my background with the Washington Conservation Corps, and then give an overview of the program and its structure and how folks can go about partnering with the Washington Conservation Corps, how folks could join as a member, with the Washington Conservation Corps. And then I'll dig into a little bit about the different types of control methods that the WCC uses on invasive species all across the state. So I'll talk about my background first, and then just the overall structure, like what the capacity is for our program and a little bit of the history. And then I'll talk about some of the other types of projects and service that the WCC provides before I'll dive into the different types of invasive species control. So I'm originally from Virginia. I grew up there and I went to college there. I noticed actually yesterday that during the webinar that we had somebody logging in from Rockbridge County, Virginia, which is not far from where I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia. So hopefully we have a couple more people from Virginia. I even invited my mom to watch this webinar since she's back there in Virginia. But I graduated from the College of William and Mary. I got a degree in political science with a focus on environmental studies, and then decided to do a service program through AmeriCorps, which is the federal level organization that oversees lots of different service programs throughout the country. And this was the National Civilian Community Corps, the NCCC program. And I did that right after college, and I was based in the Western region. And at that time, the headquarters was in San Diego, and you would travel around doing a variety of different community service projects. And that was my very first introduction to the Pacific Northwest, was coming up here to serve out on the Kitsap Peninsula at a couple of YMCA camps and a Camp Easter Seals. That was one of our rotations. And so that was my very first introduction to the Pacific Northwest. After that program ended, I bounced around the West Coast for a little bit, but ended up back in the Seattle area. And I had a couple of internships with a couple of nonprofits to start out my career there in Seattle. And the first was with Grist Magazine, which is an online environmental magazine that provides daily, weekly updates on the local, state, national, international environmental news stories. It also has its own advice columns, does its own investigative journalism. It was a really great exposure to a lot of different environmental issues, both in the Pacific Northwest and all across the country and the globe. After that internship, I realized that I really wanted to continue learning more about salmon issues. When I grew up in Virginia, a salmon was a salmon to me. I just knew that they tasted really good on the barbecue. And during my time at Grist, I learned a lot more about salmon, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, and decided to take another internship at Save Our Wild Salmon Campaign, which focuses on the grassroots and advocacy of the return and improvement of the wild salmon runs on the Columbia and Snake Rivers. But those two internships were both indoors, and I had moved to the Pacific Northwest to appreciate the outdoors, and I really wanted to be outdoors and work with my hands and continue working on salmon-related issues. So in 2004, I joined the Washington Conservation Corps as a field crew supervisor. And for 11.5 years, I implemented habitat restoration projects with King County's Department of Natural Resources and Parks. So that was planting a lot of native species in the riparian areas, streams, creeks, rivers, wetlands, and then controlling invasive species along those riparian corridors with the focus on stream habitat improvement. So I ran crews out in the field for 11.5 years, and then I took a position at the WCC headquarters in 2015 as a project developer and logistics coordinator. My project developer role at that time was managing contracts with our local partners. And then I have shifted more focus recently to full-time logistics. So I procure and distribute, manage the uniforms and the fleet for our program. And then I also do a lot of program support and trainings. So I just wanted to start at the beginning to give a little bit of the history with the Washington Conservation Corps. So the program has been around since the early 1980s, created in 1983 by state legislation to create job opportunities for young people with the downturn in the logging industry in the early 80s. It was modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps concept that was part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. And with that legislation, they created multiple Washington Conservation Corps within several different state agencies. So there used to be a WCC program at Fish and Wildlife, at Washington State Parks, Washington State Department of Natural Resources, and here Department of Ecology. In 1994, the Washington Conservation Corps program became part of an AmeriCorps program. So AmeriCorps was instituted or implemented under the Clinton administration. And that was a way to get young people involved in their communities and reward them with an education award that they could use to pay off existing student loans or use for future tuition costs for higher ed. And then in 2011, the other WCC programs and other state agencies had kind of dwindled. And then in 2011, the Washington State Legislature folded all WCC operations under Department of Ecology, where it all is housed today. So that's just a little bit of the background of the WCC. So our current structure, we have over 350 members and staff that are here underseen with the Department of Ecology. Most of our members are 18 to 25-year-olds, and we are also open to those who have military service. So we have military vets in our program as well. Currently, we have 51 six-person crews serving across the state, and that's everywhere from Bellingham down to Vancouver and from Port Angeles all the way to Spokane. We also have 15 individual placement positions, oftentimes referred to as interns, and they serve in a single capacity with an organization. And I'll dig a little bit more into our crews and our individual placements here with the next coming slides. So the funding structure for our program, we have 3 different sources. We receive federal support from AmeriCorps at the national level. We also do receive some funding from the State General Fund. And then the vast majority of our funding comes from our cost share partners. We have partners, we have over 100 different federal, state, local, tribal, and nonprofit partners all across the state of Washington. Some of them have been partners with us for a very long time. Some of them are brand new. Some of them will pick up maybe just a week or 2 weeks of WCC crew time. And then we have others that hire or sponsor a full-time crew. And we have several sponsors that actually have multiple crews serving with them. Speaking of, we actually have our application process open right now for folks that are interested in partnering with the WCC, either to hire a crew for a week or potentially for a year, or if they're interested in an individual placement position within their organization. So if you're interested in finding out more information, I encourage you to go to our website and look at the application where it has all of the finer details, including cost breakdowns. And new just this year, based on if it's funded through the state legislature, we have an environmental justice pilot project. And there will be no cash match required for partners that are able to implement projects in underserved communities specifically. Talking a little bit more about our members. So they sign up for 11 months of environmental service. Typically, that is October to September, which is, follows the AmeriCorps year. We do also have positions at the 3-quarter mark and the quarter term mark. We just recently completed our first 3-quarter term hiring, and that fills vacancies that happen throughout the year. And we'll be accepting applications for those quarter term positions that start in June. The application process will open in April. For our members, no prior experience is necessary. And so we get a broad range of folks that apply to our program, from 18-year-olds who have just graduated from high school and aren't sure what they want to do yet, or looking to earn some money to help pay for higher ed. We have folks that decide to take time off from college because they've gone and they realize that they're not sure why they're there and want to go in a different direction. We have folks that graduate from college and are planning on going into a completely different field, whether that be law or IT, but they really want to do a year of service. And then we have folks that have gone to undergraduate, gotten a degree in environmental studies, environmental science, and are using our program as a way to kick off their environmental career. Because no prior experience is necessary, all of our members do receive on-the-job training in all kinds of ways. And they do have the ability to gain certifications through our program. We have a couple of big training weeks, which is one is happening right now. And so that's why you get me as your presenter this week, because so much of our program is off supporting that training that's happening. So that is available for members. While they're in our program as an AmeriCorps member, they receive a living wage stipend, which happens to be the highest wage for any AmeriCorps participant in Washington State. And they also do receive health insurance, which is some of the best health insurance available for AmeriCorps members as well. Upon the completion of their successful completion of their term of service, members will receive an AmeriCorps Education Award, and they can use that education award to, again, pay off if they have existing student loans, or to pay for to pay for tuition at institutions of higher learning. And if they do have existing loans, those loans go into forbearance while they're in an AmeriCorps program. And at the completion of their term of service, the interest that accrues on those loans is also paid off by the Corporation for National Community Service, which is the umbrella organization that oversees AmeriCorps and administers it. So that's the general structure for our members. IPs, individual placements, I mentioned. They serve as an individual for a year long in positions at partner organizations. They do a lot of managing volunteer and environmental education events in an individual capacity. They can do a lot more scientific work along the lines of surveys and monitoring. They'll lead restoration projects and lots of different environmental research. So we have IPs based here in Department of Ecology, actually, and then with other sister state agencies, and then also nonprofits across the state. And you can see that map there, which shows the location of lots of our crews and IPs. You can see that we do have a Western Washington bent and focus, but we do cover the east side of the state as well. And a lot of our crews that are on the east side of the state don't serve for a single sponsor and travel around. We call them spike crews, and they pick up projects that might be 1 or 2 weeks or even a month at a time. And as I mentioned, we currently have 51 crews across the state. We're looking to stay about that size. We have had up to 65 crews back in the early 2010s. But we have landed on this for feeling like it's the best size for the structure of our organization. So we implement a lot of restoration projects for folks. So the timing of this is really nice for those of you who were able to log into yesterday's webinar around invasive species and riparian areas. There's a lot of talk about identifying those invasive species and how to control them. And the WCC is often the boots on the ground helping to implement projects to control invasive species. So we do plant a lot of native trees and shrubs. We also do a variety of other kinds of habitat improvement and recreation opportunity access for additional recreation opportunities. That includes constructing fencing, collecting marine debris from our shorelines, in-stream structures and channels. So I have a series of photographs that highlight some of those things that I'll get to in a minute. And I did just want to highlight these are just some of our partners across Washington. So we do partner at the federal level with the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, Army Corps of Engineers, the national parks here in Washington State. And then we do a lot of service projects with our sister state agencies like Washington Department of Natural Resources, Washington's Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Transportation, state parks, Department of Health and here at Department of Ecology. And then under the local umbrella, that is county and city municipality organizations. So like the city of Bellingham and city of Tacoma. King County Department of Natural Resources and Parks, which is where I served, actually now has 4 crews there in that location. We work for parks organizations, lots of different conservation districts and regional fisheries enhancement groups across the state. And then we also have partnerships with cities, the city of Seattle, Bellingham, Tacoma, and then those are some of our tribal partners, 2 of which actually host crews full time. We also work with a bunch of nonprofits, from small 1-employee nonprofits up to big statewide nonprofits. And some of these host crews for a week or 2 or a month for projects, or they may also have an individual placement within their organization. So that's a highlight of just some of our partners. So a typical WCC year, as far as what our program kind of collectively produces, just some, bare bones numbers. We'll plant a minimum of 600,000 trees and shrubs across Washington state. We'll improve or create over 1,000 acres of habitat, and we'll improve or create over 200 miles of recreation trails. And there's lots of numbers in here that aren't counted because they're kind of specialized, but as far as the big umbrella numbers that we produce for OFM, Office of Financial Management, these are our numbers that we'll meet annually. Some of our other roles for WCC, aside from just habitat and recreation, we also do wildfire response and prevention. So we do have crews up in the Skagit and Whatcom County area that partner with the DNR office there, that go out on fire lines on a regular basis every summer. And then we also are part of fuels reduction program across the state. So you can see that photo there on the right, where those crews are working on a thinning project and reducing ladder fuels, which are lower limbs that will that are closer to the ground and allow flames to climb up higher into the canopy. So we do have our crews out on wildfire response and prevention on a regular basis annually as well. We also do local disaster response. So WCC has been involved with major responses here in Washington state, from the Oso mudslide in 2014 to the Capitol Lake spill response. We've responded to Grays Harbor flooding, the Chehalis River flooding years ago. So disaster response is both locally and nationally is a big component of our program. In the past couple of years, we have been also on some of the front lines with the COVID response here in Washington state, from building emergency field hospitals for surge capacity early on, to partnering with Department of Health for test kit building. We've been doing that for close to 2 years now with WCC crews, hand rolling all of the actual individual test kits that get sent out across the state. Some of our national disaster responses, WCC has been involved since Katrina in responding to disasters all across the country. And we have also gone outside the contiguous United States. We've responded to flooding in Alaska. We've been to Saipan and Guam in the US Virgin Islands. You can see photos here of some of the standard muck and gut that our crews help homeowners remove debris from flooded houses so that they can rebuild. We've responded to Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Harvey. We'll either do debris removal, and we also do some more traditional hazard tree removal and that kind of stuff. We respond also to snow and ice storms. We've done snow removal off of public buildings in Spokane, Washington, when they received much larger snowfall than normal. And we've also responded to damage from trees coming down during ice storms in the Midwest. So that is an big component of our program as well. I mentioned a little bit earlier, I did want to highlight our Creosote Log Removal project. So this is a program that's been around since about 2004. I was actually involved in one of the very first Creosote Log Removal projects. Creosote has a lot of toxins in it, and when it washes up on our shorelines, it can then have those toxins leach into the environment. So we have a dedicated crew now that goes along shorelines and clears creosote logs and other marine debris. And we actually respond to public inquiries and public notifications through the MyCoast app. So along with the Washington Invasives app that you can use to identify and report invasives, there's also a MyCoast app where you can report creosote logs on beaches, and our crews will eventually get around to removal of those. And just this past month, I actually got to go out on a creosote log removal project at McNeil Island and help remove logs that had been reported by a WCC forage fish crew a couple of years before through the MyCoast app. So that was kind of pretty sweet to be able to see everything come full circle from a WCC crew reporting those logs to being there with a WCC crew to help remove them. And then I just wanted to highlight some of the other kinds of projects that the WCC can be involved in when with our partner organizations. We have all kinds of capacity, and these are just some of them. You can see the upper left, those are experimental floating wetlands that were being constructed for King County's Department of Natural Resources and Parks. And then you can see some of our crews involved with a smolt trap down there on the bottom left. In the middle, they're doing a spawner survey of salmon there you can see. And then on the right, that crew is installing what's called a beaver deceiver to allow beavers that could be considered nuisance beavers due to the flooding from their ponds to coexist by creating those structures that allow water to flow that the beavers can't dam. So typically our WCC crews, our 6-person crews, show up with a standard complement of hand tools and power tools in a 6-person 4-wheel drive truck. And then if there's any kind of special gear or equipment, our partner organizations will typically supply that along with expertise. Our folks are great on the ground, boots on the ground, implementing projects, but typically we'll have somebody from a partner organization that will be overseeing and managing the project from that end. So I did want to jump into talking about some of the different kinds of control methods that WCC crews will use. The first off is manual, good old fashioned, using our hands and legs and backs a lot. You can see myself and a former crew member controlling yellow flag iris there by literally ripping it up out of the muddy stream bank and wetland areas. And manual control also may involve using simple hand tools as well. And you can see our crew supervisor, Mitchell Biggs, with a giant oversized Scotch broom that he dug out individually. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of brute strength to remove and teamwork for controlling and removal of invasive species. You can see folks there with a giant pile of nightshade, and then on the right, folks are collectively removing a whole bramble full of Himalayan blackberry. So that's one of our standard methods, is showing up and using our hands and basic power tools. Basic hand tools, not power tools. That'll be next. That would be mechanical control. So everything from using our WCC trucks to rip out butterfly bush, to using equipment with mow decks on them for dealing with blackberry and reed canary grass. We also show up with brush cutters, which is one of our standard issue tools for dealing with weeds like blackberry. And you can see here on the right, there's a whole assortment of different power tools that we use for controlling invasive species mechanically. We also do use chemical control. So most all of our WCC crew supervisors have their pesticide applicator license through the Washington State Department of Agriculture. On the left, you can see photos. That is the very first Japanese knotweed control that King County's Department of Natural Resources and Parks started with back in 2004. And at that time, it was the very first control attempts on Japanese knotweed. So we were stem injecting those canes with 100% herbicide. And we have progressed in that time because you can imagine how labor intensive stem injecting every single stem in a giant patch of Japanese knotweed. For those of you familiar with it, know how densely that can grow. On the right, you see one of our crew supervisors using the EasyJect Lance, which is one of my favorite, very favorite chemical control methods. It uses tiny 22 caliber bullets full of herbicide that are then stem injected into woody invasives. And so you have virtually no exposure to the operator, and you have very little chance for drift onto non-target species. And we do do a lot of backpack spraying, especially on Japanese knotweed, but lots of other weeds here in Washington State as well. And so typically our sponsors will provide the backpack sprayers and the herbicide for the target species that they're going after. One of the more important things, but not as talked about, concepts is prevention. So it's way easier to prevent the spread of invasive species than to try and control it after the fact, after it has been identified, and then you come up with a control plan afterwards. So all of our crews have boot brushes issued to them so that they can scrape their boots and all of their equipment before leaving a site. And you can see there in the middle, we have a crew installing a boot brush on a hiking trail for that same concept, to keep invasive species seeds from being tracked onto trails, because trails and roads are one of the most common ways that invasive species are spread. We do also have mobile herbicide workshops that our restoration specialists, crew supervisors put on for our program, where they go around to all the crews in a region and put on a day-long training on how to make sure your backpack sprayer is calibrated correctly, how to identify different and new emerging invasive species, and different control methods, and using integrated pest management and best management practices with our projects that involve invasive species control. I did want to highlight some of our specific control projects. I know that a lot of the focus has been on Western Washington weeds. So I wanted to make sure to highlight some of the efforts in Eastern Washington. This is Russian olive control in the Moses Lake area on some U.S. Fish and Wildlife land. So using a combination of our different control methods, from mechanical with the chainsaw to the crews dragging them into burn piles. And then Cropina vulgaris control at Lake Chelan. This has been an annual project that the WCC has been involved with, a partner with U.S. Forest Service for a long, long time. Our crews will take the Lady of the Lake up Lake Chelan and then spend an 8-day spike. So that is typically a Thursday to Thursday project out in the backcountry, and we'll be spraying hillsides and also doing manual control. It's I always told the crews when I went out there, it's the most gorgeous place you'll ever get to be to control invasive species. So that is an annual project that we continue to partner with the U.S. Forest Service on that. And I did want to highlight 2 other invasive species projects that WCC has been involved with a little bit that are going to be highlighted later in the week here during Invasive Species Week, Awareness Week. And that's the European green crab. Our crews have just started being involved with the identification and capture European green crab, and that is in the Drayton Harbor and Birch Bay areas. And I know that there's also later this week a presentation on giant hornets. And even when our crews aren't directly involved, the WCC alumni network is pretty far wide spread at this point. And so the Sawyer from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources that cut down the very first giant hornet nest in a tree is a former WCC crew supervisor from our program, Dan Defoe. So our program is involved in all kinds of different ways of controlling invasive species throughout Washington State. And I just wanted to highlight some of those different things. So with that, I did want to leave time for questions. And I did want to make sure to highlight that in April, our request for projects deadline, April 18th, for anyone interested in hiring a WCC crew for a week or a month, or potentially for a full year of service, or our individual placements. And I also wanted to remind folks that our quarter term members application process will open in early April for positions that start in June. And then the big hiring season for us kicks off in late July to hire the vast majority of our members that will be starting in October. So that application opens in late July, and we do hiring throughout the months of August and September to have those crews ready to start at the beginning of October. So with that, I wanted to open it up for questions.
Fantastic. Well, first off, thank you so much, Peter. I'm really pleased to be putting the spotlight on the Washington Conservation Corps. And every time that I interact with you, I learn more about the crews, and my gears start turning about ways that we could partner with the Washington Conservation Corps to do more invasive species prevention and removal. I think that's my hope is that we'll generate some new projects for you. I guess for questions for the audience, go ahead and enter your question into the chat box, and I'll then facilitate the questions to being asked to Peter and let him respond. And the first question I have, Peter, is involving the match waiver for underserved communities that you had mentioned. You got the slide up with the deadline, which I think is fantastic to leave up. Can you elaborate on that match waiver a little bit? And I guess first off, what is the matching requirement for WCC?
Yeah, so typically we do require a match from all of our partner organizations, and that is in our application process. And so there is a component for all of our partner organizations to bring to the table. But it's brand new this year, so we'll see how it goes. But if it's funded, we'll be able to go into a lot more areas and communities, and maybe help with some of those very small nonprofits that maybe don't even have a full-time employee and are working in underserved communities. That we do a lot of work out in public lands, on private lands, but they tend to oftentimes be in more rural areas. And we're interested in partnering with all kinds of different underserved communities. And hopefully this will open up some new opportunities for us and for new partners to come on board. But all of that information is available in the requests for projects on our website. So I've been instructed to drive everyone to that application process for the finer details. I did want to highlight, because for those folks who aren't familiar with the Washington Conservation Corps, what a typical week is for our program. Normally our crews work 4 10-hour days, Monday to Thursday from 7 a.m. to 5:30. We are able to modify our schedule depending on needs from our partner organizations. And as I mentioned, we do have the ability to spike, which is when we send a crew out on a project site that they are typically not going to be returning to their home base from. And sometimes that is for 4 days or for 8 days. And so we can be up 8-10 miles on a backcountry trail without having to come out each day. And so that allows us to maximize our time on the project sites.
Great. Well, yeah, and thank you to the Conservation Corps for that match waiver. That's fantastic that you're removing some barriers to get crews on the ground in underserved areas. That's really awesome to hear. So the second question, Peter, it's great that you mentioned the Washington Invasive Species application for reporting and detecting invasive species. And as a plug for that, if you are looking for a great digital field guide for invasive species, whether plants or animals or insects or other wildlife, you can download the Washington Invasive Species app called Washington Invasives for free for Android and iPhone devices. And that is a digital field guide, but it also allows you to take a photo and send us a GPS location of whatever you're finding on the landscape. So for invasive species, definitely consider downloading that app. And if you run across something that is a potential problem, see something, say something, snap a photo and send it right to us. But our question, Peter, involves creosote log removal and detection. And do you know if Washington State University beach watcher programs, for example, are being educated about creosote logs and encouraged to do reporting?
I don't know about that specific thing, but if they're encouraging members to use the MyCoast app for that, then that is built into that app. There's all kinds of different things you can do on the MyCoast app, from helping do citizen science by reporting like the king and queen tides levels to see, to document for sea level rise. But also within that app, there is a specific component for reporting creosote logs on a beach, and it'll ask you to like snap a picture and give a description. So then our crews can kind of take that, well, not our crews, but Washington State DNR's marine debris removal program folks will take that information and then try and be strategic in planning the projects out.
Great. Well, yeah, definitely. If you see something, say something is a good mantra for anything. So if you spot those creosote logs, you should download the MyCoast application. That's neat. So Peter, you showed some really great photos of mechanical control, of brush cutters, of mowers. What types of equipment does the Washington Conservation Corps have access to? And if you don't have something, how do you go about procuring it?
Yeah, we do issue brush cutters and chainsaws and hedge trimmers as standard kind of tools for our crews. And then, as I was mentioning, if there's any kind of specialty gear that a sponsor would want to use, they either need to own that already or rent it for our crews. That's typically how that goes. So those big mowers are typically rented, like the mini excavators with the mow decks on them. We do have partner organizations that own brush hogs and those smaller size devices. So they'll bring them to the project sites for our crews to use.
Fantastic. I really appreciate seeing the prevention being inserted in this and seeing the boot brushes being issued, as well as installing boot brush locations at trailheads. Does the Corps itself have some kind of policy requiring decontamination, or how does the crew approach prevention?
Yeah, we talk about best management practices with that, both during our trainings and, well, the orientation for our program and our trainings, and then at our mobile herbicide workshops. So we don't have like we follow Department of Ecology guidelines, and certainly when we have our trucks out in fields where invasive species are actively going to seed, we encourage them to go remove any debris before they leave the site, and then also go to a commercial car wash before going on to another site.
That's fantastic, especially that last tidbit. The council just queried all of its member organizations about a car wash policy, so I appreciate that, especially. Great. Well, one of the other questions we had, Peter, is about a spike being 8 days. So say if I had an 8-day long project that would require a spike, could I just request a crew for that spike, or are spikes only available to sponsors that would have a crew for a longer duration?
Nope, they are available for folks that are looking to just get a week or two. So an 8-day project would be considered 2 weeks because the standard WCC week is as a 4-day, 40-hour, 410s. So anybody who had a backcountry project would be looking at hiring a crew for a minimum of 2 weeks if they were trying to do an 8-day spike.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we haven't seen any other questions come in, Peter. I guess I got to know, you've been involved with so many different invasive species projects, and it was really great to see your photos through the years. What is your least favorite invasive species that you've either dealt with or educated others about?
Like philosophically, I think Japanese knotweed has been the most challenging because it is just so pervasive and tenacious, and going back to sites that have been sprayed 2 and 3 years and still seeing, it not looking super healthy, but still hanging on, and knowing that it doesn't take much to cause a reinfestation for Japanese knotweed. But it's also, since 2004 to now, I've seen 18 years worth of Japanese knotweed control, from when people were just assuming it was Washington bamboo and continuing to plant it because it was a nice living fence. So watching the culture change happen in the state, that's pretty amazing. And seeing the impact of 18 years of control on the landscape. So anytime I see it, I still get a little hairs on the back of my neck twinging. But also blackberry. I mean, blackberry is the one that it feels like is a never ending battle with that, just because it's so pervasive in our state, but it also really fights back. And so most of our members, after a week of blackberry control, come back looking like they've been attacked by feral cats, because they're all scratched up and pulling blackberry thorns out of their fingers and other parts of their bodies all the time. So between those two, those are certainly some of the biggest challenges.
Great. Well, it was really awesome to learn about all the different crews across the state, that there's over 350 members, that you're working with over 100 different partners. I guess from your viewpoint, in invasive species, are we losing ground, are we holding ground, or are we winning?
Kind of depends on the day and the location and the species. There is plenty of job security in invasive species control. I will say that. And, I remind our members that we don't need to add to it, which is why we focus on prevention so much. There's some great success stories out there. And then there's some stories where we are still learning lessons on. But for instance, the squeal on pigs, on feral wild pigs in Washington State, that rapid detection and reporting, I think is a really amazing story compared to what you see going on in other states across the country. They're never going to get rid of their wild pig problem in Texas. And we don't really have any of that happening in Washington State. So I think that's a really amazing success story. I think you see that carryover with the giant hornets, right? The Department of Agriculture got on that very quickly. And that was a very new emerging invasive species here that could have tremendous impacts on the agriculture industry here in Washington State. And they were very fast acting upon the first detection of it, coming up with plans for control and getting citizens involved in the reporting process and education. So I think that it just kind of depends on which invasive species you want to focus on, whether and the lens, but obviously restoration invasive species control is always kind of long-term lens, right? So there'll be plenty of short-term gains, but you always got to have the longer-term perspective. And back in 2004, when I was stem injecting knotweed along rivers on King County, I was like, this is never going to go anywhere. But the science changed, the best management practices changed, and I go back to those same sites where I was injecting in 2004, and you just have an amazing native canopy established now where there used to be Japanese knotweed.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate your perspective on that. And yeah, as a segue into tomorrow's webinar, we're going to be focusing on prevention of aquatic invasive species such as invasive freshwater quagga and zebra mussels. And definitely it takes partnerships. We have to work across all organizational boundaries in one way to both prevent the problem as well as solve the problem when it does arrive. And that's what we'll be discussing tomorrow. So definitely hope that y'all can join us for that. And happy Invasive Species Awareness Week. Thank you again, Peter, for hosting this. This has been fantastic. And I've got some follow-up questions to ask you offline about getting a crew, for example. So you'll hear more from us, and I expect you'll hear more from some of the other participants on the webinar as well. So thank you so much, and happy Invasive Species Awareness Week, everyone.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate the opportunity.